There is a woman named Priya who wakes at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her alarm, because her body has learned to anticipate the ritual. She lights a specific candle, sandalwood, ordered from a small batch artisan in Portland, and sits on a meditation cushion that cost her $240. She breathes. She journals. She pulls a tarot card and photographs it for her Instagram stories with the caption, "Trusting the universe today." She has 14,000 followers. She has not spoken honestly to her mother in 6 years. She is, by every metric she has constructed for herself, deeply spiritual. She is also, and this is the thing nobody will say to her face, one of the most successful avoidants alive. I am not writing this to condemn Priya. I am writing this because I have been Priya. Not in the candles and the tarot, but in the mechanism, that specific, practiced art of building an architecture of meaning so elaborate and so beautiful that you never have to look at the foundation. And the foundation, for Priya, for me, for a staggering number of people who would describe themselves as on a spiritual path, is cracked. The foundation is the actual, unmetaphorical, brutally ordinary life that lies beneath all the ritual and language and the carefully curated sense of peace. The marriage is dissolving slowly, like a ship taking on water in a fog. The career has become a slow suffocation, wearing the mask of stability. The grief has been reframed so many times, as a lesson, as a gift, as karma working itself out, that it no longer resembles grief at all. It resembles content. This is what I want to talk about. Not spirituality as a whole, not the deep human need for transcendence or the genuine, irreplaceable value of contemplative practice. Those things are real. Those things have saved lives, including, in certain specific moments, mine. What I want to talk about is the specific mutation that has happened, the way something that was supposed to be a confrontation with reality became, for millions of people, the most sophisticated escape from it ever devised. The way the vocabulary of awakening became the perfect dialect of avoidance. The way you can now, in 2024, construct an entire identity around the concept of doing the inner work, without ever actually changing a single concrete thing about your life. Let me tell you about Marcus. He is 34. He was a software engineer in London, good at it, well paid, genuinely competent, who, after attending a 10-day Vipassana retreat in 2019, described to me a profound spiritual awakening. He quit his job. He spent 6 months in Bali. He trained as a yoga teacher. He started a podcast about conscious living. None of this is unusual. The unusual thing about Marcus is what he told me 3 years later, in a bar in East London, after his third beer, which he prefaced by saying, "I'm not really supposed to drink," a remark that told me the beer was doing important emotional work for him. He said, "I think I used spirituality to avoid the fact that I was just lonely and scared of intimacy. I called it not being attached. I called it being present. I turned my avoidant attachment style into a philosophy of life, and then built a following around it." He didn't cry when he said this. He looked like a man who had been slowly realizing something for a very long time and had finally found a sentence for it. The sentences matter. The sentences are the difference between a realization and a performance of one. What Marcus described is not rare. It is, I would argue, the defining spiritual pathology of our era, and to understand why, you have to understand something about the specific cultural moment in which modern spirituality, the wellness industrial complex, the Instagram shamanism, the microdosing retreats, the breathwork circles, the shadow work journals sold at Urban Outfitters, actually emerged. It did not emerge from a genuine collective awakening. It emerged from a collective crisis of meaning that coincided precisely with the atomization of community, the collapse of traditional religious structures, the rise of algorithmic anxiety, and the monetization of interiority. In other words, people became genuinely, structurally desperate for something that felt true. And into that desperate vacuum poured an industry that understood, with extraordinary commercial instinct, that the most profitable version of spiritual experience is the one that asks nothing hard of you. This is the thing you have to sit with. Really sit with it, not in a meditative sense, but in the way you sit with something that makes you uncomfortable, which is the only honest kind of sitting. The most profitable version of spiritual experience is the one that asks nothing hard of you. It offers transformation without disruption, peace without confrontation, growth without loss. And it does this by performing the language of depth, shadow work, integration, holding space, nervous system regulation, ancestral healing, quantum consciousness, while systematically removing every element of genuine spiritual practice that historically made it effective. Extended solitude, community accountability, material renunciation, prolonged discomfort, and the irreversible commitment that signals to your own psyche that something real has changed. The philosopher who helps me most here is not who you'd expect. It's not some ancient Eastern sage. It's Erich Fromm, the mid-20th century psychoanalyst and social philosopher who wrote about what he called the escape from freedom. Fromm's central argument, developed in the shadow of fascism, watching entire societies voluntarily surrender their autonomy to authoritarian systems, was that freedom, genuine freedom, is psychologically terrifying. Not because people are weak, but because freedom means responsibility, and responsibility means you are the author of your own suffering. That is unbearable. So human beings develop what Fromm called mechanisms of escape. Automaton conformity, authoritarianism, destructiveness, all different flavors of the same deep need to hand the weight of your existence to something outside yourself. What Fromm could not have anticipated, because he died in 1980, was that the 21st century would produce a mechanism of escape so perfectly calibrated to the modern psyche that it would be almost indistinguishable from genuine liberation. He could not have anticipated the spiritual market. He could not have anticipated that you could now escape the weight of your freedom, not into fascism, not into rigid conformity, but into a personalized, aesthetically beautiful, therapeutically fluent, Instagram-documented practice of inner work that functions at its worst as the most elegant cage ever constructed for a human soul. Because the cage looks like a garden, because the bars are made of rose quartz and positive affirmations, because the lock is opened with a mantra you paid a retreat center $4,000 to give you. I am being hard on this, I know I am, and here is where I have to slow down and be honest about the counter-argument, because it is real and deserves to be heard without condescension. The counter-argument goes like this: for a very large number of people, particularly women, particularly people from marginalized communities, particularly trauma survivors, mainstream psychological help was either inaccessible, culturally incompetent, or actively harmful. The medical model of mental health treats their suffering as a dysfunction rather than a response. Traditional religion often added shame to pain, and then came this wave of somatic practices, trauma-informed breathwork, community healing circles, plant medicine ceremonies, and embodied spirituality that said, your body holds wisdom, not just pathology. Your grief is not a disorder to be medicated into silence. Your ancestors' suffering lives in you and deserves to be acknowledged. For many people, this was genuinely the first language that fit their experience. It saved them. It gave them a framework in which they were not broken, just hurting, just human. This is true. This is completely devastatingly true. And I hold it with both hands. I hold it next to everything else I'm saying. Because both things have to be true at once, and the refusal to hold them together is itself a kind of spiritual bypassing, which is the precise term the psychologist John Wellwood coined in 1984 for the phenomenon we are circling. Spiritual bypassing, the use of spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. Wellwood was not condemning spirituality. He was a meditator himself. He was describing what happens when a genuine vehicle for transformation is conscripted into the service of defense. When the thing that was supposed to carry you toward what is difficult is used instead to carry you away from it. And so the counter-argument, yes, it has helped many people, and the diagnosis, yes, it has also become a sophisticated mechanism of avoidance for many people, are not contradictions. They are two effects of the same cause. The cause is this: when any practice is removed from the context of genuine accountability, prolonged difficulty, and community-embedded commitment, when it becomes a product you purchase and content you consume, it will, over time, tend to bend toward the psychological gravity of comfort. This is not a failure of will. It is physics. It is what happens to everything in a market economy. Comfort sells. Discomfort doesn't. And so the market gradually, inevitably, produces a version of the practice that maximizes comfort and minimizes the genuinely hard parts. And those parts, the genuinely hard parts, are precisely the parts that made it work. There is a woman I know named Sophia. She is 41 years old, a secondary school teacher in Manchester, and she spent 4 years deeply involved in what she describes as a spiritual community, a loose network of coaches, facilitators, and practitioners centered around a charismatic teacher who held monthly retreats and weekly online gatherings. Sophia is not naive. She has a master's degree in educational psychology. She understood, intellectually, what she was doing. And yet, she told me once with the particular precision of someone who has spent a long time understanding something they wish they didn't. It filled the exact shape of my loneliness. It gave me belonging. It gave me language for my pain. It gave me the feeling of growth without requiring me to change any of the actual structures of my life. I still had the same job I was miserable in. I still hadn't grieved my divorce. I still called my estranged sister once a year and called that maintaining the boundary. And I called all of it, spiritual progress. She said the moment she realized something was wrong came during a weekend retreat in a group sharing circle when another participant described losing her job, her apartment, and her relationship within a year as the universe dismantling everything that no longer serves me. Sophia watched the whole room nod, smile, and say, "Powerful," and "so much medicine in that." And she felt, in her stomach, a cold, specific nausea. The woman who had said it looked like she was drowning. She looked like she was using the language of sacred transformation to avoid the much simpler, much harder fact that she was in crisis and needed help that the circle could not provide. Practical help. Material help. A therapist, maybe. A social worker. A friend who would sit with her in the ugly, non-transcendent mess of it without reaching for meaning. Sophia left the community. She described this as one of the loneliest decisions of her life, because the community had become her primary social world, which is itself a feature, not a bug, of certain kinds of spiritual communities, the way they gradually become total environments that make leaving feel like a kind of spiritual death. She spent 6 months in what she called genuine desolation. She started seeing a trauma-informed therapist. She filed for a career change, spent a year and a half retraining, took a significant pay cut, and taught a different subject in a different school. She called her sister. Not once a year, twice a week, for months, until it stopped being terrible and started being something else. I'm not going to tell you it was worth it, because that's not the point, and Sophia would hate me for it. The point is that it was real. The point is that not one moment of it looked like a spiritual awakening. There was no aesthetic to it, no Instagram caption for the Tuesday afternoon she spent on the phone with her sister, arguing about something that happened in 1997 at a family dinner, the argument degenerating and regenerating over 90 minutes until both of them were exhausted, and the thing that needed to be said was finally said, and it wasn't healing and it wasn't beautiful. It was just true. Just brutally, plainly, undeniably true. And that truth did something that 4 years of retreats and sharing circles had not. You came to the retreat with 40 pounds of unexpressed grief. You cried for 3 days. You left feeling 35 pounds lighter, but you didn't reconfigure anything. You just released 5 pounds of pressure and learned to carry 35 pounds more comfortably. And then next year you come back for another release. This is the specific mechanism of the trap. Not malice, not a conspiracy, just the ordinary psychological hydraulics of comfort-seeking meeting a market that has every incentive to provide comfort and no incentive to offer the kind of sustained, accountable, structurally disruptive challenge that would actually be useful. The retreat center needs you to come back. The coach needs your monthly retainer. The community needs your continued membership. None of these financial realities make the people involved evil. Sophia's teachers were not evil, and Marcus's community was not a cult in any meaningful sense. They were just operating within a system that gradually, inevitably bends toward what keeps people engaged and paying. And what keeps people engaged and paying is not what changes their lives. It is what makes their lives feel meaningful without requiring them to change. And here I need to bring in the other thinker who has shaped how I understand this. Albert Camus. Not the Camus of the quote mine, not the one must imagine Sisyphus happy, bumper sticker. The Camus of the myth of Sisyphus, where he makes an argument that has been buried under 100 years of misappropriation. Camus is writing about what he calls the absurd, the collision between the human need for meaning, for clarity, for transcendence, and the universe's complete indifference to that need. The universe does not speak. It does not provide signs. It does not send downloads. And Camus says that the honest, courageous response to this collision is not to resolve it, not to find the meaning that makes it bearable, not to construct a spiritual system that fills the void, but to live within it. To keep asking the question without reaching for the answer is what makes the question stop hurting. He called the alternative philosophical suicide. The leap, the moment when the unbearable tension of the absurd becomes too much, and you leap into religion, into ideology, into any system that promises to resolve the irresolvable. And what is the wellness spirituality complex if not a spectacularly well-packaged leap? You came to the retreat with 40 pounds of unexpressed grief. You cried for 3 days. You left feeling 35 pounds lighter, but you didn't reconfigure anything. You just released 5 pounds of pressure and learned to carry 35 pounds more comfortably. And then next year you come back for another release. This is the specific mechanism of the trap. Not malice, not a conspiracy, just the ordinary psychological hydraulics of comfort-seeking meeting a market that has every incentive to provide comfort and no incentive to offer the kind of sustained, accountable, structurally disruptive challenge that would actually be useful. The retreat center needs you to come back. The coach needs your monthly retainer. The community needs your continued membership. None of these financial realities make the people involved evil. Sophia's teachers were not evil, and Marcus's community was not a cult in any meaningful sense. They were just operating within a system that gradually, inevitably bends toward what keeps people engaged and paying. And what keeps people engaged and paying is not what changes their lives. It is what makes their lives feel meaningful without requiring them to change. And here I need to bring in the other thinker who has shaped how I understand this. Albert Camus. Not the Camus of the quote mine, not the one must imagine Sisyphus happy, bumper sticker. The Camus of the myth of Sisyphus, where he makes an argument that has been buried under 100 years of misappropriation. Camus is writing about what he calls the absurd, the collision between the human need for meaning, for clarity, for transcendence, and the universe's complete indifference to that need. The universe does not speak. It does not provide signs. It does not send downloads. And Camus says that the honest, courageous response to this collision is not to resolve it, not to find the meaning that makes it bearable, not to construct a spiritual system that fills the void, but to live within it. To keep asking the question without reaching for the answer is what makes the question stop hurting. He called the alternative philosophical suicide. The leap, the moment when the unbearable tension of the absurd becomes too much, and you leap into religion, into ideology, into any system that promises to resolve the irresolvable. And what is the wellness spirituality complex if not a spectacularly well-packaged leap? After his retreat, he told his wife. Then he told his business partner. He began reducing his accounting hours and started attending a writing group. This is where it gets uncomfortable, and this is where I need you to stay with me, rather than rushing to the consolation of a triumphant ending, because there isn't one, not in the conventional sense. Daniel spent 2 years writing his novel. He submitted it to publishers. It was rejected 16 times. By this point, he had reduced his income by 40%. His relationship with his wife had become extremely strained, not because she was unsupportive in principle, but because the practical reality of reduced income with 2 teenage children in a city as expensive as Nairobi did not yield gracefully to the language of authentic living. They argued about money in ugly, specific ways that had nothing to do with spiritual awakening. His business partner bought him out. The 17th publisher offered him a very small advance for a modified version of the novel that, in his view, was less honest than what he had written. He took it. He told me, over email, we had been corresponding for about a year at this point, that accepting the advance felt like both a betrayal and a relief, and that the proximity of those two feelings was itself a kind of education. He said, I don't know if I'm happier, I think I'm more myself. Those are not the same thing, and nobody told me they wouldn't be. The book came out the following year. It sold modestly. It was reviewed twice, once positively, once with the specific cruelty reserved for literary debut novels. He and his wife are still together. He still does part-time accounting. He writes in the mornings before the house wakes up. This is not a success story in the way the spiritual content industry would tell it. There is no viral moment. There is no, I trusted the universe, and it provided. There is just a man who looked at his actual life without the aesthetic of awakening and made a series of genuinely costly choices, lived with their genuinely mixed results, and is, in some important way that resists easy description, more present in his own existence than he was before. This is what real looks like. It doesn't look like a testimonial. It doesn't look like content. You came to the retreat with 40 pounds of unexpressed grief. You cried for 3 days. You left feeling 35 pounds lighter, but you didn't reconfigure anything. You just released 5 pounds of pressure and learned to carry 35 pounds more comfortably. And then next year you come back for another release. This is the specific mechanism of the trap. Not malice, not a conspiracy, just the ordinary psychological hydraulics of comfort-seeking meeting a market that has every incentive to provide comfort and no incentive to offer the kind of sustained, accountable, structurally disruptive challenge that would actually be useful. The retreat center needs you to come back. The coach needs your monthly retainer. The community needs your continued membership. None of these financial realities make the people involved evil. Sophia's teachers were not evil, and Marcus's community was not a cult in any meaningful sense. They were just operating within a system that gradually, inevitably bends toward what keeps people engaged and paying. And what keeps people engaged and paying is not what changes their lives. It is what makes their lives feel meaningful without requiring them to change. And here I need to bring in the other thinker who has shaped how I understand this. Albert Camus. Not the Camus of the quote mine, not the one must imagine Sisyphus happy, bumper sticker. The Camus of the myth of Sisyphus, where he makes an argument that has been buried under 100 years of misappropriation. Camus is writing about what he calls the absurd, the collision between the human need for meaning, for clarity, for transcendence, and the universe's complete indifference to that need. The universe does not speak. It does not provide signs. It does not send downloads. And Camus says that the honest, courageous response to this collision is not to resolve it, not to find the meaning that makes it bearable, not to construct a spiritual system that fills the void, but to live within it. To keep asking the question without reaching for the answer is what makes the question stop hurting. He called the alternative philosophical suicide. The leap, the moment when the unbearable tension of the absurd becomes too much, and you leap into religion, into ideology, into any system that promises to resolve the irresolvable. And what is the wellness spirituality complex if not a spectacularly well-packaged leap? And here I have to ask you something, and I am going to ask it without softening it, because softening is exactly the problem. When you think about your own spiritual practice, whatever form it takes, whether it is meditation, journaling, therapy, that has started to feel more like a comfortable conversation than a confrontation, retreats, the teachers you follow, or the community you belong to, can you point to a single concrete, structural change in your life that has resulted, not how you feel about your life, not the narrative you now carry about your life, not the compassion you extend to yourself for why your life is the way it is, but the actual architecture, the relationship, the work, the city you live in. The conversation you have been refusing to have for 3 years, the decision you have been describing as not yet aligned, for long enough that not yet aligned has become a personality trait. Because here is what Wellwood understood, and what the spiritual market has very carefully not understood. The purpose of genuine inner work is not inner peace. Inner peace is a side effect. The purpose, the actual, historically documented purpose of every serious contemplative tradition, from Zen Buddhism to the Ignatian spiritual exercises to the Sufi path of annihilation, is contact with reality. Greater, more sustained, less defended contact with what is actually true about your situation, your relationships, your desires, your fears, and the world you are actually living in, not the world you are ascending above, not the higher dimensional perspective from which your problems look small, the actual, ground level, 3 a.m., tax deadline, aging parent, difficult marriage world. The purpose of the journey inward was always to make you more available to what is outside you, more responsive, less defended, more capable of genuine, costly, non-aesthetic action in the specific life you have. Somewhere in the transition from practice to product, this orientation flipped. The journey inward became the destination. The meditation cushion became the sacred space, not the training ground for everything that happens off it. The retreat became real life, and ordinary life became something to Integrate your retreat insights into, by which people usually mean, carrying the feeling of the retreat into life for as long as possible before it dissipates. But feelings dissipate. That's what feelings do. That's not a spiritual failure. That's biology. And the structure of your life, the actual commitments, the actual relationships, the actual work you show up to do in the world, does not change because you feel differently about it for 2 weeks after returning from Bali. I think about Viktor Frankl here, not as a quote to deploy but as a life to reckon with. Frankl survived 3 years in Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. He watched his wife die. He lost most of his family. He spent the worst years of a human life in conditions of systematic degradation and genuine proximity to death. And what he described in Man's Search for Meaning was not transcendence. He was very precise about this. He was not claiming that meaning made the horror beautiful or bearable in any absolute sense. What he claimed was more difficult than that the ability to find meaning in suffering was not an escape from suffering, but a way of maintaining a relationship with one's own humanity within it. Meaning not as a buffer between himself and reality, but as a reason to remain present to reality rather than dissociate. The distinction is everything. He was not using meaning to make the camps feel like a spiritual retreat. He was using meaning to resist the psychic death of withdrawal from engagement with what was actually happening. This is the precise inversion of what modern spiritual culture does. Modern spiritual culture uses meaning to create distance from what is actually happening. It uses the language of higher purpose not to stay present in difficulty, but to reframe difficulty as something other than difficulty, as opportunity, as medicine, as curriculum. And while I understand the psychological function of this reframing, while I can see how, for a person in genuine crisis, the transformation of "I am suffering helplessly" into "I am being broken open" can be the difference between survival and collapse. While all of that is true and real, it becomes, when applied not to acute crisis, but to the chronic, ordinary, solvable problems of a reasonably comfortable life, not survival but avoidance. It becomes a way of making the pain of your unchanged life spiritually coherent, rather than a reason to change it. There is a specific personality type, and I say personality type, not dismissively but descriptively, that is particularly vulnerable to this dynamic. It is the person who has developed an extraordinarily sophisticated internal life and an extraordinarily underdeveloped relationship with external action. The person who processes everything, who has language for every shade of their emotional experience, who can articulate their childhood wounds with clinical precision and their attachment patterns with the fluency of someone who has read all of the books, because they have read all of the books, who has genuine insight, genuine depth, and who uses that depth, again and again, as an alternative to the much harder, much blunter, much less articulate work of actually changing something in the external world. I know this person because I am, at my worst, this person. I have used analysis as armor. I have used understanding as a substitute for action. I have mistaken the sophistication of my self-knowledge for progress, when what I actually had was a more elaborate and more beautiful cage. And the cage was lined with genuine wisdom. That's the thing. The insight is real. The understanding is real. But it is possible to understand everything about why you do something and still do it. It is possible to have perfect clarity about the psychological origins of a pattern and perfect powerlessness to interrupt it, because understanding and interruption are different functions, served by different parts of the nervous system, requiring different kinds of work. You cannot think your way out of a behavioral pattern. You cannot meditate your way out of a behavioral pattern. You have to do something different, in the world, with your actual body, in time. And there is no aesthetic to that. There is no spiritual grammar for it. It is just the exhausting, incremental, often unsuccessful work of choosing differently in the specific, non-sacred moments of your ordinary life. Let me tell you what that looks like, because I don't think we talk about this enough. Not the glamorous version of change, the retreat decision, the dramatic career pivot, the ending of the clearly toxic relationship. The unglamorous version, the version that doesn't make good content. Nadia is a 38-year-old graphic designer in Berlin. She spent 3 years in what she described as deep spiritual exploration after a breakdown following the end of a long relationship. She did the work. All of it. The therapy, the plant medicine, the retreats, the journaling, the shadow work. And she told me not as a failure, but as a fact, that after 3 years she had extraordinary clarity about every single thing that had gone wrong in the relationship, and she was just as incapable of being in an intimate relationship as she had been when it ended, because the work she had done was entirely internal. She had processed the relationship. She used that word, processed, and I noticed how clinical it sounded, how it made intimacy sound like waste management, but she had not practiced being in one. I know this person because I am, at my worst, this person. I have used analysis as armor. I have used understanding as a substitute for action. I have mistaken the sophistication of my self-knowledge for progress, when what I actually had was a more elaborate and more beautiful cage. And the cage was lined with genuine wisdom. That's the thing. The insight is real. The understanding is real. But it is possible to understand everything about why you do something and still do it. It is possible to have perfect clarity about the psychological origins of a pattern and perfect powerlessness to interrupt it, because understanding and interruption are different functions, served by different parts of the nervous system, requiring different kinds of work. You cannot think your way out of a behavioral pattern. You cannot meditate your way out of a behavioral pattern. You have to do something different, in the world, with your actual body, in time. And there is no aesthetic to that. There is no spiritual grammar for it. It is just the exhausting, incremental, often unsuccessful work of choosing differently in the specific, non-sacred moments of your ordinary life. Let me tell you what that looks like, because I don't think we talk about this enough. Not the glamorous version of change, the retreat decision, the dramatic career pivot, the ending of the clearly toxic relationship. The unglamorous version, the version that doesn't make good content. Nadia is a 38-year-old graphic designer in Berlin. She spent 3 years in what she described as deep spiritual exploration after a breakdown following the end of a long relationship. She did the work. All of it. The therapy, the plant medicine, the retreats, the journaling, the shadow work. And she told me, not as a failure, but as a fact, that after 3 years she had extraordinary clarity about every single thing that had gone wrong in the relationship, and she was just as incapable of being in an intimate relationship as she had been when it ended, because the work she had done was entirely internal. She had processed the relationship. She used that word, processed, and I noticed how clinical it sounded, how it made intimacy sound like waste management, but she had not practiced being in one. She started dating, not consciously, not as a practice, not with a journal prompt about her intentions. She just started being around people, accepting invitations she would normally decline, tolerating the discomfort of wanting to leave situations where she was expected to stay and be present, and staying anyway. She described the first few months as hideous, the antithesis of everything she had learned in her years of practice. She said, "Every spiritual instinct I had developed told me to pull back, to protect my energy, to only show up where it felt aligned, and I had to override all of it, because aligned had become my word for safe, and safe had become my word for alone." It took her 14 months of what she described as consistent low-grade discomfort before something shifted, before the discomfort became not comfortable exactly, but workable, before she found herself in a conversation at a party she would previously have left within 40 minutes, and at the 2-hour mark, realized she was not performing presence, she was just present. And she said that specific moment, not a ceremony, not a breakthrough, not a download, just a Tuesday night at a party where she was present with another person without needing to either escape or explain herself, felt more genuinely transformative than anything she had done in 3 years of deliberate spiritual work. What she had experienced was not insight. It was closer to what the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty called motor intentionality, the way the body learns through doing, through inhabiting new patterns in the actual world, not by thinking about inhabiting them. The body learns differently from the mind. The nervous system changes through repeated engagement with the thing that frightens it, not by processing the fear of the thing in a contained, ceremonial setting where the thing is not actually present. You cannot process your fear of intimacy in a circle of people who are also processing their fear of intimacy. You can name it there. You can feel seen in it. You can have a genuine, valuable moment of recognition. But you can only resolve it, not cure it, not eliminate it, but change your relationship with it by being intimate with someone who is not there to hold space for you, who is also frightened and imperfect, and sometimes unkind, in the ordinary, non-ceremonial context of an actual life. This is the cost that modern spiritual culture has refused to acknowledge, not the cost of transformation. It will happily speak at length about that cost, in language that makes it sound beautiful and necessary. But the specific, unglamorous cost of genuine engagement with the actual world, the cost of staying in the difficult conversation past the point where you have nothing wise to say, the cost of disappointing someone you love by choosing something they don't support, the cost of building something in the world that is not yet good, that may never be as good as the version of it in your head, and building it anyway with your name on it in public without the protection of "it's just a practice." There is a cultural critic, not a philosopher in the formal sense, but someone whose thinking deserves that category, named Barbara Ehrenreich, who spent years investigating the American culture of positive thinking and its relationship to genuine wellness. She argued, in her book Bright-Sided, that the mandatory optimism of American self-improvement culture, the imperative to reframe everything as an opportunity, to find the lesson in every suffering, to maintain positive effect as a kind of civic and moral duty, was not just psychologically ineffective but actively harmful. It pathologized negative emotion. It defined realism about difficulty as a failure of mindset. It created a culture in which the honest acknowledgement of genuine suffering, genuine structural injustice, and genuine irreversible loss was itself treated as a spiritual failure, as a sign that you were in your ego, or not yet at that vibration, or still attached to the victim story. This is where the spiritual market and toxic positivity converge, and where both do their most insidious damage. Not in the obviously false or foolish claims, not in the astrology and the crystals and the quantum healing, which can be dismissed or accepted on their own terms, but in the meta-message that runs beneath all of it. The meta-message is, the measure of your spiritual development is how you feel. If you feel at peace, you are growing. If you feel disturbed, you are triggered and need to do more work. And this meta-message, which in a certain light sounds like wisdom, is, in practice, one of the most effective thought-terminating cliches ever introduced into the culture of personal development. It means that any evidence the practice is not working, any continued suffering, any persistent dissatisfaction, any failure to feel peace, is immediately reinterpreted as proof that you need more practice. The system becomes unfalsifiable. The cure for insufficient healing is more healing. The response to inadequate peace is more elaborate peace-seeking. And life remains unchanged. I want to say something about addiction here, not metaphorically but structurally. The neurological signature of spiritual bypass, the particular way the retreat circuit, the ceremony circuit, and the doing the work circuit function in the brain, bears a structural resemblance to what we see in behavioral addiction. Not because spiritual practice is addictive in itself, but because the specific pattern of seeking periodic, intense experiences of relief or transcendence as a substitute for the sustained, effortful work of changing your daily baseline has the same reward architecture as other behavioral addictions. The intense experience temporarily elevates the baseline. The return to ordinary life produces a relative drop, which feels worse in comparison to the elevated state than it did before the elevation. This gap, between the elevated state and the ordinary baseline, creates the motivation to seek the next elevation. Ordinary life feels increasingly insufficient compared to the retreat state. The retreat state feels increasingly necessary to manage the insufficiency of ordinary life. This is why people who have been deeply immersed in certain spiritual communities often describe difficulty returning to ordinary life, which they initially interpret as not yet finished integrating. Sometimes that's what it is, but sometimes, and this is the thing nobody in the community will say, it is an early sign of a dependency pattern. Ordinary life has become genuinely unbearable, not because it was always this difficult, but because periodic transcendence has raised the hedonic baseline beyond what ordinary life can match. And the solution the community offers, more retreats, deeper practice, longer immersions, is, structurally, the same as the solution a drug offers, more of the substance that is causing the dependency. Not a reconnection with the ordinary, more escape from it. I think about where all this leads, and I keep arriving at the same, uncomfortable place. The place Simone Weil arrived at when she wrote about attention, not mindfulness in the consumer sense, but something more demanding. She described attention as the highest form of spiritual practice, and she meant something precise by it. The capacity to remain present to reality as it is without projection, without wish, without imposing meaning onto something before it has revealed its own nature. Pure, sustained, humble receptivity to what is actually there. She was talking about prayer when she wrote this. She was also, I think, talking about the only thing genuine transformation has ever required from anyone. The willingness to look at what is actually in front of you, without the protection of a framework that tells you what it means before you have looked. And this is where I run out of road. This is where I have to stop describing the problem and say what I actually think, which is this. I think a significant number of people currently engaged in what they call spiritual practice are, consciously or not, using that practice to avoid the one thing every genuine spiritual tradition has always, in its most demanding form, required. Not enlightenment, not peace, not alignment, not healing. Presence. Actual, undefended presence to the specific life they are living, with its specific failures and terrors and irreplaceable relationships, and its single, non-negotiable finitude. The willingness to be here, in this particular life, not as a soul having a human experience, but as a human, just a human, with a body that will fail, a mind that will lie to itself, relationships that will be disappointing, work that will be insufficient, and a death that is coming, without the buffer of higher meaning, without the upgrade of cosmic significance, without the comfort of the spiritual story that makes all of it make sense. That is an extraordinarily difficult thing to ask of anyone. I know it is. I'm not asking it from a position of having achieved it. I am asking it from a position of knowing, in my body, the particular relief of the retreat state, the particular safety of the spiritual community, the particular comfort of the reframe, and knowing, with equal certainty, that every time I have chosen comfort over contact, something in my actual life has remained unchanged that needed to change. Every single time. Research in motivational psychology, specifically in what psychologists call the intention-behavior gap, suggests that somewhere between 33 and 50% of human behavior remains unchanged even after the individual has consciously identified the need for change, expressed genuine motivation to change, and taken initial steps toward change. And that's for people in formal therapeutic contexts with structured accountability. For people whose primary engagement with change is through self-directed spiritual practice, with its flexible timelines, its internal metrics, and its tendency to reframe the absence of change as the process. The persistence of unchanged behavior is almost certainly higher. I do not say this to produce despair. I say it because you deserve to know it. Because the system you have chosen for your growth has a specific, documented rate of inefficacy, and you are as susceptible to that rate as anyone else, and the way you would know, if you were in it, is precisely the thing the system has taught you to reframe as part of the process. So here is what is left. Not a solution. I don't have one. Anyone who tells you they have a solution to the fundamental human tendency to avoid difficulty is selling something, and what they're selling is, at some level, part of the problem I've been describing. What I have instead is a question, the hardest I know, and I am going to ask it without softening it into a practice, a reflection prompt, or a journaling exercise, because the moment I do that, I repeat the exact error I've been trying to describe. The question is this: what in your actual life, not your inner life, not your emotional landscape, not your relationship with yourself, what in the concrete, external, relational, temporal life you are actually living, has your spiritual practice made you more willing to face? Not more at peace with, not more accepting of, more willing to face, more willing to act within, more present to, in the uncomfortable, non-transcendent, ground-level sense of being present. If you can answer that question with a specific, named thing, a conversation, a decision, a relationship, a piece of work, then you have something real. Then the practice is doing what practice is for. But if the answer is, my inner life is richer, or I am more compassionate with myself, or I understand my patterns better, or I have more peace. If the answer is entirely internal, entirely about the quality of your experience, rather than the quality of your engagement with the world, then I want to suggest, as carefully and as directly as I know how, that you may have built something very beautiful and very safe, and that, in this context, safety is not the same as growth, and beautiful is not the same as true. The research on behavior change consistently shows that the people most likely to make genuine, lasting changes to the concrete structure of their lives are not the people with the deepest insight, the greatest self-compassion, or the most sophisticated understanding of their own psychology. They are the people with the highest tolerance for the specific, ordinary discomfort of acting imperfectly in a world that will respond to them imperfectly. They are the people who can do the hard thing badly, repeatedly, in public, without the protection of meaning, without the reassurance of alignment, without the container of ceremony, and keep doing it anyway. This tolerance for imperfect action in an imperfect world cannot be developed in retreat. It cannot be downloaded in a ceremony. It can only be developed in the ordinary, non-sacred, non-aligned Tuesday mornings of your actual life, by doing the thing you have been preparing to do, without being ready, without being healed, without being certain it will work. Priya will wake up tomorrow at 5:47 a.m. She will light the candle. She will breathe. She will pull the card. She will photograph it. And the photograph will be beautiful. The candle will smell perfect. And the morning will feel, genuinely, like something sacred. None of that will be false. None of that will be the problem. The problem will be the silence between the morning ritual and the moment she picks up her phone to call her mother. The problem will be in that silence and in what she does with it, whether she fills it with another practice, another scroll, another podcast about conscious living, or whether she lets it stand there, ugly and unresolved and demanding nothing less than the actual, uncurated, non-sacred act of picking up the phone and saying the thing she has not said for 6 years. That silence is where this ends. Not with a call to action, because you have heard all the calls to action, and what you have done with them is make them into content. Not with a challenge, because challenges, in this context, are just another form of the thing I've been describing, another externally provided structure that lets you feel like you are engaging with change without requiring you to generate the motion yourself. Just with this, the silence. The specific, particular silence between the life you are constructing around yourself and the life you are actually living inside it. You know what is in that silence. You have probably been filling it for a long time with something that sounds, on the outside, exactly like the truth. Only you know if it is.